Okay, so this is what we're going to use to prove that the tilt of the Earth's axis is actually what is going to lead to our seasons. This is how we're going to do it. Right here you see this very, very bright orb, and this is our sun. We also have our Earth that I was showing you before. Keep in mind that the Earth will have a tilt throughout this demonstration, so that tilt we are going to have pointing over this way. Now, we are going to simulate the Earth traveling around the sun, and its tilt will always point in the same direction because that is how its tilt behaves in real life. It is always pointing towards the North Star. If you look, we are going to start at this position right here. Keep in mind that this is not to scale, especially the distances. It's done more so for dramatic effect, and so that it's very obvious to see. If you look, you will see that the sun is shining onto the Earth. However, it is more concentrated in one area than the other. So if you can see here, you might notice that the southern hemisphere is receiving what we call direct light. It is getting the most direct and concentrated rays from the sun, whereas the northern hemisphere is not. It is still getting sunlight, but it is not direct. We would call that indirect light. Based on that evidence, we can conclude that the southern hemisphere is experiencing summer during this time. Meanwhile, the northern hemisphere is experiencing winter. Let's continue on our journey. We are going to start traveling around the sun in a counterclockwise fashion. Our next stop is our second point. My tilt is still pointing the same way, but you notice how in this situation, neither hemisphere is getting more direct light. Instead, both hemispheres are getting a pretty equal amount of light. And this would actually then conclude that we are experiencing fall or spring. We are not going to be experiencing summer or winter because both hemispheres receive a relatively equal amount of sun. We could call this fall or spring. Depending on which hemisphere we're talking about will essentially determine which hemisphere has which season. But let's go back and just think about it. So if this was our first stop in which the southern hemisphere had summer, the next season for the southern hemisphere would have to be fall, just based on the actual order of the seasons and the fact that this season would come after the one before it. That means that spring would be occurring right now in our northern hemisphere. Our next stop, we have our Earth continuing to travel around the sun, and we have the tilt the same. If you notice now, we have the northern hemisphere is getting that direct sunlight. That's going to lead to longer days, higher temperatures, summer weather. Meanwhile, the southern hemisphere is going to have winter. It is getting indirect rays. And then finally, our last stop. Our last stop is going to involve the same situation as we saw before with an equal amount of sun on the northern and southern hemispheres. And so this will lead to fall and spring. Our northern hemisphere will have to have fall because it just experienced summer, and the southern hemisphere will have to have spring because it just experienced winter. So in reality, the reason for seasons has nothing to do with